jumping straight back into all the football news on today's episode of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. We're continuing to talk about the Dallas Cowboys in this week's episode. Today's episode, now finishing talking about CeeDee Lamb and his contract extension. Great news for the Dallas Cowboys, but now some unfortunate news on the other side of the ball for one of their defensive backs. That would be DaRon Bland, because last week, in the preparation to their final preseason game, no starters were really going to play. It was really the Trey Lance show. He played the entire game pretty much, and, it was all about the backups and getting the necessary reps to make any final decisions on the final 53-man rosters that have to be finalized by tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. But in the lead up to that, one of their final practices before their Saturday game, their all-pro defensive back, DaRon Bland, was feeling some discomfort in his foot on Wednesday during their practice, and then afterwards, he got more of an evaluation done on his foot, and the scans and the examinations revealed that there was a stress fracture in DaRon Bland's foot, which now means he will have to undergo surgery, and he'll likely be out for the next 6 to 8 weeks, which is pretty crushing for the Dallas Cowboys just because of everything that was swirling around them. If they didn't get that CeeDee Lamb extension done just today, this would have looked a lot worse than in hindsight, in totality, obviously, if they still didn't have their wide receiver there, and now their top one or top two corner was going to be out for pretty much the first month and a half. This would have almost been the worst case scenario for the Dallas Cowboys. So fortunate for them, they got it together and extended CeeDee Lamb. But more on DaRon Bland, based on his timeline and the 6 to 8 weeks that he's projected to miss for the start of the regular season. The first 4 weeks of the season, he will most likely miss if he is going to be out about 6 weeks at the earliest. So in terms of the Cowboys schedule and the teams they'll be playing, the first week 1 matchup, it'll be against the Cleveland Browns. So that one's going to hurt, not having DaRon Bland out there. You're going to have Trayvon Diggs obviously back, but it would have helped a lot to have him there, switching on and off with Amari Cooper, not just having Amari motion over to the other side of the field and be away from one of your top corners. That's the luxury you have, obviously, right, with having Bland and Trayvon Diggs. But now that could be a potential issue, and also the Browns added Jerry Jeudy, who is trying to rebuild and reestablish himself in a new situation, now moving on from the Denver Broncos. So that'll be an interesting one, not having DaRon Bland, especially at Cleveland. It should make it a bit tougher, obviously, against that defense, not to mention as well for the Dallas Cowboys. And also, week 2, they're going to be at home, their home opener against the New Orleans Saints, and it should be a little bit easier on paper, but honestly, I had so many questions about this Cowboys roster and just team and how it was going to look. I honestly didn't think CeeDee Lamb would be back. I felt like the Cowboys were just going to keep stalling, but that should be a win in week 2 at home in Dallas against the New Orleans Saints. And then you move on to week 3 at home again against the Baltimore Ravens, and you're hosting the current AFC conference appearance team. They didn't win the conference championship. I almost said they did, but they made it there at least. And coming off of the bat of last year, how successful they were. Now another year for Zay Flowers, another year for Lamar, getting further in the playoffs. Not to mention they add Derrick Henry. Yeah, they might not have wide receivers that you might technically not need to have a DaRon Bland or a Trayvon Diggs completely shut down, but still, this offense is very, very explosive now with the combination of Lamar and Derrick Henry. Those guys, more often than not, are going to have to tackle one of these guys, one of these runners, instead of covering. So that going up against a high-powered Ravens offense should be a little bit more tricky, but not as hard as having, a number one, a 1B type of receiver on the opposite sideline. So that one could go either way. I might still give it to the Ravens, but either result wouldn't surprise me. Then the last one that DaRon Bland would for sure miss would be at the New York Giants, and the Giants are the Giants, right? In New York, I can't remember the last time the Giants beat the Dallas Cowboys, so that should be a win. And if you go 2-4, if you win 2 of the 4 games to start the year of those first 4 weeks, if you split it, that's not the end of the world. Technically, I think that's as good as you'd like to finish in those games. If you win the Baltimore game, that's even better. But overall, and even the Cleveland game, that was 92 impossible to win. But those are definitely the tougher ones. They should win against the Saints, and they should win against the Giants, even without DaRon Bland. But that's at the earliest expected return date for DaRon Bland, because then he has a chance to return at Pittsburgh in their following game after the New York Giants, but that's about 6 weeks, so he could technically take longer, and that's when it gets a little bit more difficult, because at Pittsburgh is already going to be a little bit tougher than, say, the Giants and the Saints, and around the same level of difficulty as the Cleveland Browns. So to not have him there, yeah, the Steelers don't have, again, 2 great wide receiver ones. They only pretty much have one with George Pickens, but it's still on the road. You're still traveling across the country, and those games could get a little bit tricky if you don't address the situation right from the start. And then after that, if DaRon Bland is still trying to get back, you don't want to rush him, but he is getting closer and closer. After Pittsburgh, they have a home game against the Detroit Lions, so that's a little bit better. But, you have to monitor how DaRon Bland is looking, and then they're going to travel to San Francisco and play the reigning NFC Conference champions in the 49ers, and that's ideally, you'd like to have him back for one of these games at least, at Pittsburgh and then going on at the Lions and going on. You don't want him to miss all 3 of those games because, yeah, he might be getting extra rest, but all those games could, worst case scenario, go wrong. The only one that I'm sure they're more favored in is against Pittsburgh, and that's, again, on the road. It could get a little bit tricky if you don't handle your business. So that's a tough stretch of games that you would like DaRon Bland to come back, hopefully, if he's able. And, talking more about Bland and what he actually brings, if you haven't really been keeping up with who he is and how big of an impact he made last year, just going into his 3rd season, 25 years old now. He led the NFL with 9 interceptions last year, and he set a new NFL record with 5 pick sixes as well. 5 of the 9 interceptions he returned for touchdowns, and that's 45 points, if my math is correct, on those touchdowns. So those are huge. Those are huge because not only is the Dallas Cowboys offense, really good, but for those odd games where they're struggling, they can't get anything going, or the opposing defense is just that good, and it's just a slugfest, low-scoring game, getting someone to change the course, the momentum, just the entire vibe around a game with a pick six or just an interception in general with 9 last year is huge. And it's something that the Cowboys defense really thrived off of last year because they weren't so dominant in stopping the run. They weren't so dominant in stopping the pass per se. Big part of that is not having Trayvon Diggs, obviously, and then the Cowboys' run defense has been a problem for the last few years. But those turnovers really kill any sort of good feeling, any sort of momentum that the opposing offense is starting to generate. You almost feel like you have your backs against the wall. You're almost backpedaling, and you can't stop an opposing offense. But just out of nowhere, DaRon Bland comes out of nowhere, jumps a pass, or he reads it perfectly and gets an interception, and that way it stops everything and it shocks the opposing offense that way. And now, if he starts building that reputation, you're almost, I wouldn't say afraid, but you're a little bit more cautious throwing it over to that side of the field because if you're a little bit late or if it's not placed in the right situation for your guy to get it or for it to just go out of bounds, more often than not, he's going to make a play on it, and then that way you don't want to ruin the game if you're an opposing quarterback and throw him an interception, right? And not to mention that, but the Cowboys were looking so forward to having that partnership with Bland and Trayvon Diggs on either side of the ball because similarly to Trayvon Diggs about 2 seasons ago, they were almost in the same situation. Trayvon Diggs picked off every ball. It seemed like that came his way, and now you had 2 of those guys being turnover machines. It was going to be a lot of fun, ideally, for the Dallas Cowboys defense if they did lose a lot of guys. Just this offseason, they had Leighton Vander Esch retired. Dorrance Armstrong went to the Commanders. Stephon Gilmore signed with the Minnesota Vikings. Dante Fowler Jr. also went to the Commanders as well. You lost a lot of guys, but you still had the opportunity, the chance to change the entire course of a game by having guys like that in the secondary to get interceptions, and not even that, just get pick sixes would have been great. But now that's going to have to be put on hold for the foreseeable future. And we'll see. We'll see how long DaRon Bland comes back and how much this Cowboys defense needs him, because there's going to be a lot of new pieces. I think they lost, I'm trying to remember his name. I don't want to mess it up. I think it was Sam Williams, their pass rusher, that they lost to a torn ACL earlier this offseason. So that sort of affected the pass rush. You don't know who else is going to step up outside of Micah Parsons and who's going to be in at linebacker as well. You have a new defensive coordinator coming in, and while it's Mike Zimmer, an established, well-known name on that side of the ball, it is, a new group of players trying to adjust to a new system, and you want to have all your best players there, right? That's why it was such a big deal when Micah wasn't there, but now you get him back, but unfortunately you lose DaRon Bland. So it's just another hurdle. All teams deal with injuries like this. A bunch of teams have had season-ending injuries already to some of their most prominent players, but this Cowboys defense should be, I don't expect them to fall off of the face of the earth, but this does raise some more difficulty, and it does put a little bit more stress on the offense to maybe know now that this defense might not be as locked down as it was before. So the margin of error shrinks a little bit because you don't have that leeway knowing that you can just get a turnover, know that your defense is going to stop them. More pressure on the offense, and an offensive side of the ball that has more questions, I would even say, than the defensive side of the ball. So how they ramify that will be something to keep an eye on. But for right now, that is all the news we have on the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to move on to some other topics on today's show. When we come back after the break, Mike Tomlin, the head coach of the Steelers, announces that he will make a final decision on his starting quarterback after this week of practice. And later on, we're going to dissect the quarterback performances from Drake May and Jacoby Brissett in their final preseason game last night. We're going to get into all of that when we return after this break.
Look